in the name of personal injury law.
Today I have with me Steve Sinas, a personal injury attorney at the Sinas Dramus Law Firm, and we're going to talk about motor vehicle crashes with pedestrians. Thank you, Steve, for coming on. I hope you can answer some questions for us about those pedestrian accidents.
Thanks for having me.
So how often are pedestrians in Michigan injured by auto accidents?
So according to the Michigan State Police, over the last 20 years, there have been 20,000 crashes involving pedestrians. And over 80% of the time, the pedestrian is either seriously injured or killed. So this is a real serious issue. Over 100 pedestrians are killed each year in Michigan. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to being a pedestrian, your safety and your rights.
Can a pedestrian receive Michigan no-fault benefits even if they don't have their own insurance?
Yes. So if you are walking down the road as a pedestrian and you're hit by a motor vehicle, which by the way does not include a motorcycle, but if it's a car, an SUV, a truck, you're going to be entitled to no-fault benefits. There can be some exceptions, but in general, you should assume that you have some rights to pursue there. No-fault benefits include coverage for your medical expenses, your income loss, also some household services. So it's a really important right, but you can recover these benefits.
What damages can Michigan pedestrians recover from the at-fault driver?
The first place to start is whether the person has no-fault insurance coverage. If they do, you then need to determine how much coverage they have for their medical expenses. If on the no-fault side of things, they're covered for life, they're probably not going to have what we call an excess medical expense claim to pursue against the at-fault driver. But if they have less than lifetime coverage or no-fault coverage, they can pursue their uncovered medical expenses from the at-fault driver. So one of the rights can include your medical expenses. The other one is your income loss that's not covered by no-fault insurance. So you look at how much no-fault insurance is covering, and if that coverage expires after 3 years and the person still has a disability, they can pursue their uncovered excess income loss from the at-fault driver. In addition to that, they can recover pain and suffering damages if they satisfy certain rules where they're making a claim against the at-fault driver for compensation for their loss of quality of life, their pain and suffering, and it's a way of imperfectly compensating somebody for the impact their injuries have had on their life.
How do you determine negligence in a Michigan pedestrian case?
Negligence is a concept where we're asking whether the parties involved used reasonable care at the time the incident occurred. So when you're considering the at-fault driver, you're asking, did that driver use reasonable care in operating the motor vehicle? Part of that is whether the driver violated the Michigan Motor Vehicle Code. So you look at what the rules of the road are, so to speak, and see if the driver violated any of those rules. You then also look at the circumstances of how the crash occurred and any other facts and issues that could affect whether or not that driver could have said to have been using reasonable care or not. At the same time, you also have to look at the conduct of the pedestrian. Was the pedestrian comparatively negligent is the question that the law asks juries to consider, meaning did the pedestrian somehow contribute to the crash? Was the pedestrian walking out in a roadway where there wasn't a crosswalk? Did the pedestrian jump out in front of the car? Was the pedestrian not looking? There are all kinds of issues you have to examine in terms of how the pedestrian was behaving to determine who has fault and who doesn't.
What about the rights of pedestrians who are injured in a hit-and-run accident?
Pedestrians injured in a hit-and-run accident have the same rights as any other pedestrian, but the reality is that they have a harder time pursuing those rights because they don't know who hit them. And if you can't identify the driver, you don't know who to sue. And so if you have a truly unidentified hit-and-run driver, it's going to come back to whether the pedestrian has uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage in their own auto policy that's in their household that would cover them for any damages they could have had against the at-fault driver, because that's what uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage does. It kicks in if the driver doesn't have insurance or can't be identified. But if you're going to pursue one of those claims, there are some strict timelines you have to follow on hit and run uninsured and underinsured claims. So you really have to act quickly, and in those situations, getting a lawyer right away would be advisable.
Can the injured pedestrian recover uninsured and underinsured benefits?
An injured pedestrian may have the right to pursue uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. It's going to depend on their auto insurance policy, whether it provides coverage for the facts and circumstances of where they were injured. There can also be the issue of a person living in a household where there's a policy, but it's not issued to them. And the question is whether the policy actually covers them as well, even though it's issued to some other relative or someone else they're living with. So the right can be there, but it's going to depend on the facts and details and the insurance coverage available to the injured person.
So I know that the Sinas Dramus Law Firm is very passionate about helping educate people to keep them safe. What resources are there out there to educate people, to tips to keep them safe when they're pedestrians?
Yeah, well, Michigan.gov has got some really good common sense pointers for pedestrians. So that's a good resource to turn to. As far as just general guidance, pedestrians have to understand that they have obligations to follow the law as well as motorists do. Everyone's got to follow the law. So when you are walking as a pedestrian, consider whether you're walking on the correct side of the road. Obviously, be looking out for motor vehicles when you're crossing the road. And you want to make sure you're not distracted too. We have a lot of cases where people are walking, looking at their phone, you have their AirPods in, and they don't see the motor vehicle that they're walking in front of. So you have to remain vigilant as a pedestrian. And as a motorist, you have to understand that there are many rights that pedestrians have to walk in certain places where you might be driving, where you might take a right-hand turn at an intersection. So everyone has to remain vigilant and follow the law.
Do you have any memorable pedestrian cases that you've worked on?
I had a case where a girl was crossing the road, not at a crosswalk. She had just picked up some food and was walking. The road was lit up with street lights. She had dark clothing, and a car came out of an apartment complex and hit her. And the driver of the car said that he thought that she was either a trash can or a mailbox and wasn't sure what he hit, so he kept on driving. And then we had to track him down, or actually the police tracked him down, and we were able to find his insurance coverage and we were able to make a recovery for the girl. But not only did we have the issue of the hit and run aspect, we also had them disputing that our client was the one who was at fault because she was crossing where there wasn't a crosswalk. And we argued that she was there to be seen and he wasn't paying attention. And we ultimately were able to get a settlement.
Now, earlier you mentioned something about if a pedestrian's hit by a motorcycle, that the rules are different. Can you briefly tell us what that's all about?
Yes, so when you are hit by a motorcycle is not considered to be a motor vehicle under the Michigan no-fault insurance law. So in that situation, there would be no motor vehicle involved, so you would not have the right to claim no-fault insurance benefits. Your rights would be governed by a negligence claim against the motorcyclist, assuming the motorcyclist was at fault. And you can, in that situation, pursue not just your pain and suffering, but also your medical expenses from the motorcyclist.
But if you are hit by a motorcycle in a hit and run, there's basically nothing for you?
If you're hit by a motorcyclist and it's a hit and run situation, it's going to depend on whether or not you have coverage that would cover you, like uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage for that type of crash. It's also going to be affected by whether or not you can find out who the motorcyclist is, and if you can, identify their insurance coverage, and in that situation, you might be able to make a recovery.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Dramus Law Firm.